One of the most intriguing aspects of the Franco-Prussian War is the fact that no other major European powers intervened. Considering that several of these powers would have had something to gain from joining one side or the other, this raises a compelling question. Why didn't any of the great powers become involved in the conflict? Let's explore why. The United States. A spectator from afar first. Let's address the most straightforward reason. The United States. There were two major factors that prevented America from getting involved in European affairs during the Franco-Prussian War. The first reason was simple. America didn't care. The war had little to no short-term impact on the U.S. American leaders at the time, were far more concerned with their own internal issues, and had little interest in meddling with European politics. After the bloodshed of the American Civil War, the United States was focused on healing and rebuilding. The idea of intervening in a European conflict, especially one involving autocratic leaders, would have been an incredibly unpopular and risky proposition. The second reason was the aftermath of the Civil War. Having just emerged from one of the bloodiest and most destructive conflicts in its history, the United States was in no condition to take on another war. With much of the country still in ruins, especially the southern states, it was unimaginable to launch any overseas operations. The wounds of the Civil War were still fresh, and America had no desire to involve itself in foreign entanglements, especially for the benefit of either Prussia or France. Austria-Hungary, too much at stake. Moving closer to the action, the Austrians were in a difficult position. Just 4 years prior, they had been utterly defeated by Prussia and its ally Italy in the Austro-Prussian War. This defeat had left the Austrian Empire severely weakened, bringing it to the brink of collapse. In response to their loss, Austria embarked on major reforms, transitioning into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This change was partly the result of a need to stabilize the empire, especially after losing so much power in the war. At this time, the Hungarians had a significant say in the workings of the empire, and they were firmly against any kind of military intervention. Their primary concern was to avoid any conflict that might risk their newfound autonomy or invite further conflict with Russia or Italy, two powers that were seen as potential threats. Given that Austria was still recovering from its defeat just a few years earlier, the risks of getting involved in the Franco-Prussian War were deemed too high. The Austrians were also wary of the possibility of France or Prussia gaining control over important territories like Saxony or Bavaria, which would threaten their interests in Central Europe. So despite their desire for revenge against Prussia, Austria simply wasn't in a position to take on any additional military conflict. Italy, a balancing act. Italy's position was also complex. Having been an ally of Prussia in the 1866 war, Italy seemed like the most likely candidate to join the Prussian side in the Franco-Prussian War. However, Italy had complex relationships with both Berlin and Paris. While Prussia's support had been essential in helping Italy drive the Austrians out of the Italian peninsula in 1866, the situation had changed in the intervening years. By 1870, Italy had made significant gains, including the unification of its territories, but France played a crucial role in Italy's annexation of Venetia. The Italian government, caught between its past alliances with Prussia and its historical ties to France, found itself in a diplomatic bind. But the core reason Italy did not intervene was much more pragmatic. Its army wasn't strong enough. Despite its successes, Italy's military had struggled in previous conflicts, particularly against the Austrians. Both Prussia and France boasted far more capable armies, with highly trained soldiers and advanced weaponry. Italy's military was simply not equipped to take on such formidable forces. Furthermore, Italy's internal politics were unstable, and the cost of entering a foreign war was too high. The risk of overextending itself in a conflict between two of Europe's most powerful nations was too great, and Italy wisely chose to remain neutral, focusing instead on its own internal development. Russia, a power struggling between two rivals. Let's now delve into Russia's position in the Franco-Prussian War. Russia, unlike the other powers, found itself in a precarious situation. It had relations with both Prussia and France, but neither side was ideal for its long-term strategic interests. Russia had fought against France in the Crimean War, a conflict that had left deep scars. The Russian Empire suffered humiliating defeats, and the war undermined its influence in Europe. This history naturally soured Russian relations with France, making any potential alliance with Paris unappealing. Russia's interest in supporting France during the Franco-Prussian War was nearly non-existent, especially considering the recent history of humiliation. However, Prussia's rise was equally alarming to Russia. While their relationship had been somewhat amicable, the emergence of a unified German empire was a direct challenge to Russian dominance in Eastern Europe. Prussia's growing strength threatened Russia's influence over Central Europe, which was crucial to its ambitions. If Russia supported Prussia, it would be aiding the very power that would soon challenge its dominance in the region. Russia's dilemma wasn't just geopolitical, it was personal too. While the Tsar was always concerned about the balance of power in Europe, supporting either Prussia or France came with its own set of complications. Aiding Prussia would make Russia's eastern rival stronger, while supporting France would deepen tensions with a country that had already humiliated it in the past. So, what did Russia do? It stood by, watching from the sidelines, waiting for the conflict to resolve itself. It would be a neutral player, avoiding direct involvement and watching carefully as the Franco-Prussian War unfolded. Italy, a complex web of alliances. Now let's turn to Italy, a country that seemed like a natural ally for Prussia, especially considering their previous cooperation during the Austro-Prussian War in 1866. However, Italy's position was far from straightforward. Although Italy had been allied with Prussia in their defeat of Austria, Italy was caught in a web of divided loyalties. Italy's unification had largely been driven by Prussian military support, and it had also received significant aid from France in securing Venetia. But with the ongoing Franco-Prussian War, Italy faced a major dilemma. How could it choose sides when it owed so much to both France and Prussia? Italy's internal stability was another issue. Despite its alliances, Italy was still a young, unstable nation struggling with its identity and military capacity. The Italian army was still relatively weak, especially when compared to the dominant land forces of Prussia and France. While Italy had achieved military success against the Austrians, it had struggled to assert its influence in the face of France and Prussia. The main reason Italy stayed out of the war was simple: its military readiness. The Italian army wasn't equipped to handle the scale of the Franco-Prussian War. The country's forces had already been stretched thin in previous conflicts, and entering into a war between two of the most powerful militaries in Europe would have been disastrous. Simply put, Italy could not afford the risk. Additionally, Italy's delicate diplomatic relations with both France and Prussia prevented it from taking a side. While the Italians had been aided by both countries in the past, their involvement in the war would have further complicated matters. It was better for Italy to remain neutral and focus on its own internal affairs, rather than risk the wrath of either side. Great Britain, isolationist strategy. Across the English Channel, Great Britain had a clear and pragmatic strategy during the Franco-Prussian War. At this point in history, Britain had embraced a policy of isolationism in European affairs. While it maintained its alliances, its primary focus was on maintaining the balance of power rather than engaging directly in conflicts on the continent. Britain's interests in Europe were always tied to ensuring that no single power became too dominant. Prussia, an old ally of Britain, was seen as a stable force in Central Europe, while France, despite being a historical rival, was seen as a necessary counterbalance. As long as the balance of power remained intact, Britain had little reason to interfere. Britain's relationship with Prussia made it unlikely to support France in the conflict, but Britain also didn't want Prussia to emerge as the sole dominant power. The British government had no direct interest in engaging in another European war, especially one that would require military intervention. Instead, Britain hoped to mediate the conflict from a distance, ensuring that neither side gained too much power at the end of the war. The expectation in London was that France would eventually lose, but that Prussia would be careful not to take too much from France after the war. This diplomatic balancing act was typical of Britain's approach to European affairs, where its primary goal was stability rather than expansion or direct intervention. As long as the continent was not destabilized, Britain had little interest in getting involved in the fighting itself. The balance of power and why the war didn't escalate. In the end, the Franco-Prussian War remained a localized conflict, largely contained within the borders of France and Prussia. The great powers of Europe had little incentive to join the war, as their interests were either neutralized by internal issues or weighed down by complicated alliances. The United States, still recovering from the Civil War, had no reason to intervene, and the European powers simply couldn't find a common cause to fight over. But the absence of intervention didn't mean that the great powers were uninvolved. Instead of engaging in direct conflict, the powers of Europe adopted a policy of mediation. Britain, Austria, and Russia all played significant roles in ensuring that the war didn't escalate into a wider European conflict. Each nation understood that, while they might not directly benefit from the outcome, the key to preserving their own interests was keeping the balance of power intact. This delicate balance meant that, despite the potential for wider conflict, the Franco-Prussian War did not escalate beyond what it was. The interests of the great powers were best served by avoiding direct confrontation and instead focusing on influencing the peace that followed. The result was a war that, while devastating for France, ultimately didn't expand into the all-consuming European conflict that it could have been. The aftermath: a changing Europe. By the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the newly unified German Empire emerged as a powerful force in Europe. But its expansion was controlled, ensuring that no other power felt overly threatened. France, though defeated, retained its independence, and the balance of power in Europe was maintained, at least for a time. In hindsight, the Franco-Prussian War stands as a testament to the intricate and often understated diplomatic maneuvering that defined 19th-century European politics. The great powers, despite their own rivalries, understood that stability was more important than victory. They knew that a war that spread across Europe could have devastating consequences for all involved. The lesson of the Franco-Prussian War is simple. While great powers often have the ability to influence events, the true power lies in knowing when to stay out of the conflict and when to focus on diplomatic solutions. The war never grew beyond its initial scope, because the great powers realized that their interests were best served by mediating peace, rather than fanning the flames of war.